Welcome to the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. This podcast is dedicated to helping book lovers discover new authors. Like all the best bookshops, this podcast is filled with all kinds of books and all kinds of authors. So tune in, browse around, find a new author, and discover a new favorite book at the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. I'm Stacey Horan, author, book lover, and host of the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. This is episode number 170. For more information about this or any of our episodes, go to my website, staceyhoran.com. If you enjoy the podcast, leave us a review, like us on social media, and share us with your friends, family, and fellow readers. In today's episode of The Bookshop at the End of the Internet, I'm chatting with author Alison Levy about her first two books in her Daemon Collecting fantasy series, Gatekeeper and Blue Flame. In this series, Rachel Wilde is a daemon collector from a dimension parallel to ours. Her job is to catch and repair malfunctioning daemons, creatures who are out of phase with our world, who tempt people to do good or evil. But Rachel uncovers a shadow conspiracy across both dimensions and must battle criminals and dangerous creatures if she wants to save her own life and save both worlds. Alison knew she wanted to write this series, and after several attempts at drafting the first manuscript, she found inspiration for her dark world from Neil Gaiman's American Gods. Once she struck upon that aesthetic, the story came together, and the first book, Gatekeeper, was born. In this episode, I'll chat with Alison about her writing journey, how she works to build her fantasy world until she's convinced she can field questions about it, and how she discovered writing to be self-medication for her anxiety, as well as a few other things, coming up. Alison Levy, I want to thank you very much for joining me today on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me on.
I thought what we could do today is talk about your new series. You have two books in this series out, the Daemon Collecting fantasy series. If you don't mind, introduce us to the series, and then I'll want to talk about each book in turn, but maybe give us an overview and help us understand what inspired you to write this series.
Sure thing. Well, the series centers around a visitor from another dimension parallel to ours. And this dimension has been sort of long interacting with ours, kind of behind the scenes, monitoring and fixing defective daemons. Daemons being these strange creatures who that exist out of phase with reality, that tempt people for good or for evil. And sometimes they break down and don't do what they're supposed to. So the people from this other dimension collect them. That's the Daemon Collecting title, and bring them in for correction and fix them, put them back where they're supposed to be. My main character, Rachel Wilde, who she would tell you her name is pronounced Raquel, but she grudgingly puts up with the mispronunciations. She is a daemon collector, and she, in the first book, she has is given an unusual assignment. One part of the assignment being she has to find someone who has been breaching dimensional borders, and that this is something frowned upon. Whoever this is doing it without permission and causing damage, so she's supposed to find him. She's also supposed to track down a gatekeeper, which is a person who is a human, a human substitute for a daemon's ability to phase. Basically, there was a daemon a long time ago that caused an immense amount of damage, and its malfunction couldn't be fixed. So they took away from the daemon the thing that allowed it to pass through dimensions so it could be safely stored away where it wouldn't do any more damage. But they had to put that somewhere. So they put it in a person, and it then passed from that person down her family line. And she has to find the missing descendant of this person. So in the course of performing these two tasks, she unintentionally uncovers this much larger conspiracy that's happening in the shadows of her dimension and ours, and comes into contact with the missing gatekeeper. His name is Lita Morley, and a man who identifies himself only as Bach, who had basically been out of his mind for a stretch of time, but snapped back to reality and has a rare gift. He is an oracle. His rare gift allows him to just sort of acquire knowledge about past, present, and future that he has no means of knowing. It just sort of pops into his head. So she's finding him valuable, but also annoying. He's intruding upon her living space. So the first book is introduction to these characters, introduction to the world, and the introduction to this conspiracy that's happening. It's still very much in the shadows at that point in the series. As we get into the second book, the word of this conspiracy has spread throughout her dimension, her people. So there's this underlying fear and concern of they don't understand what's going on. They're very worried. But in the meantime, she has been given the task of getting Lita, the gatekeeper, up to speed on how things work in her dimension. So she and Lita have one part of the book where they're going around discussing things, and also she's sort of shadowing Rachel throughout the day. And the other part being Bach's trying to get his life back in order and kind of enlist the help of Lita's brother, Simon, to drive him around town, try to retrieve these missing pieces of his life, his identity, as he tries to get himself situated. And they kind of come back together mid-book, where they encounter a strange creature that's been tormenting a young boy and his family in their neighborhood. And no spoilers, I guess, but this poor boy has been dealing with this by himself, and he's much too young to be carrying this very heavy responsibility. And he realizes that Rachel can see the things he can see, and he's begging her for help. So she then has to figure out how to help this boy, if she can help this boy, and then reconnects to Bach's story and brings him into the mix. But that's kind of where we are right now into book 2. I just finished the first draft of book 3, so looking forward to getting that out to everyone too.
And what was the spark for you? What was the thing that made you think, "Ooh, I've got a story here"?
Yeah, that's the funny thing. I tried 2 times over the course of many, many years to get this story written down. I am not sure where exactly it came from. It was something I toyed with for a very long time. I wrote out almost the entire first book, but it was in a very different format, and I didn't like how it came out. I tried again very briefly, didn't have my head quite in the right place for it. But then I decided to pick it back up and write it again, and I think I finally got it to the point where I liked it. As for the initial spark, I really don't know. I've always been a big fan of fantasy, particularly urban fantasy, which is what I like to write. I think my the initial spark, I couldn't say where exactly it came from. My spark is to where I picked it back up and decided to give it another go and get it right. I think it was when I read Neil Gaiman's American Gods. And it was my introduction to Neil Gaiman. I actually found the book in a used bookstore, and I was reading it on my lunch break at the time. And I loved the feel for this, very much the urban fantasy, but in a way I hadn't seen it before. This gathering of all the different cultures, all the different ideas, and sort of weaving them into a modern take. And I thought, I would love to do something like that. And so I won't call it my first attempt to do that. I wouldn't compare myself to Neil Gaiman, but I definitely had that inspiration from reading it. Say, you know what, I've got something that it's a little bit of a shadow of this. Maybe I could pick it up and try it again.
Let's talk about building this world.
Mm-hmm.
Did you do a lot of planning for the world before you started writing, or is the world something that came together as you were writing it, as you were drafting it, as the story progressed?
I think in terms of world building, I almost always start with a framework, and I definitely did for this book. I had an idea of the world that the characters came from and sort of what the society looked like. I did add things on as they came up as I wrote, but I stuck with the initial framework, I think, as much as I could, as much for my own benefit to keep it straight in my head as to keep it straight on the paper for people to read. But I really enjoy world building. It's something I've always done. I think sometimes I get so caught up in the world building I forget to sit down and write the chapter. So it's always been my first passion is just to create. And so sometimes it's much harder to take what I've got created in my head and to put it into a format that other people can see.
And what are some of the things you make sure you have in a world that you're creating? Do you have sort of a mental checklist? I need to make sure I have figured out these things.
Not so much a checklist, but a feeling. I have to create it to the point where it feels whole for me. Like I couldn't just start with a couple of things and say, well, there's this and this and this. I had to sit down and say, okay, I need to flesh this out to the point where it feels like it, not necessarily that it is real, but that it could be real, that it's convincing enough that it makes some kind of sense. So in crafting Rachel's Dimension, one of the things I started with just as a vague idea was to think, well, our world descended primarily from patriarchal roots. What if hers came from matriarchal roots? How would that look? So I started with that as a starting point and just sort of ran with it from there, thinking, well, maybe marriage wouldn't be such a prevalent idea in her society. Maybe women would be more the head of family. Maybe you maybe the jobs individual sexes or genders had would be very different. So it's starting from a point and just adding on to it until it feels like, what? Yeah, I feel like now I could answer someone's questions about what's happening in this world that I created. I could write a fake headline of a news story happening in it. I could spin a little side story and it would still fit in the larger plot. So it doesn't have to be a perfect, pristine model for me to follow, but it had to be real enough that I felt like I could embrace it, I could make sense of it, and to bring it to other people that they could understand it too.
And let's talk about Rachel.
Yes.
In crafting this character, did she sort of appear to you fully formed, or did you consciously build her with certain characteristics in mind or to achieve certain goals?
Rachel, for me, starting out when I first started creating her, she was almost a sort of a wish for fulfillment exercise in some way. She's not a person I would necessarily want in my house. She's very brusque. She's impolite without necessarily meaning to be impolite. But she's also, for me, she would feel like what it would feel like to not have the issues of depression and anxiety that I wrestle with. And if I didn't have these, that we all have these sort of constraints on us of society of what's expected of us to behave a certain way, she has had a completely different background. She doesn't have the, be a good little girl background that many of us grew up with. She was encouraged to be a leader because in some ways expected of a woman in a matriarchal society. She's encouraged to be a leader. She's encouraged to be forward and blunt in some ways. So for me, it was almost it's almost something of a relief to write her, particularly her dialogue, and just that she in my head she's not mean, but she is very blunt, is very forward, and doesn't have to struggle with the same things I do. So I think that was my real jumping off place from her. In some ways, I almost had to scale her back as I was going along because I thought it's not just about me. I have to make this character into somebody very fleshed out. I can't just have her jumping at everything, being thoughtless hero in some ways. I wanted her to be a little more grounded.
And usually I ask if the main character reflects the author. In your case, is Rachel like you in ways, or do you find she's sort of the opposite of you more often than she's alike?
I would, I don't know if she's the opposite. She definitely brings to the surface, if she is like me, she definitely brings to the surface things that are more deep down in me, things that I've either learned to ignore or actively try not to think about. I think she's got a real kindness in her, but she has a definitely has a big shiny backbone that I don't have. So it's something I envy in her, something I really enjoy writing about. But the kindness in her that I'd like to think is a little more presently obvious in me is something I think she has to dig for a little harder. So is she the opposite of me? No, maybe not the opposite, but she's definitely more of a darker reflection of me, maybe.
And how about your supporting cast of characters? Are there any favorites among those? Some that you just really enjoyed writing?
I always enjoy writing Bach. He is a challenge. I haven't tried to write a lot of male characters from a male character's point of view as much, but I do enjoy writing him. He has a lot of his mental struggles, I think, in some way reflect my own anxiety and depression, even though his are far more extreme and far more outlandish in some ways. But he does have that sort of struggle where it's always there with him. You particularly start to see it in the second book where it has these moments where there's almost a relapse threatened, and where he starts to sink back into that that dark place where he lost his mind. And that's not, I think anyone who's struggled with mental health like myself will recognize a little bit of that, where there's that struggle. There's always sort of that looming thing on the sidelines. It's like I don't want to go back to that, but I know it's there. Like I can't really ignore it. So I enjoy writing that from him, and particularly seeing his growth in the second book was a lot of fun to write and very rewarding for me. Lita has been a bigger challenge. It I wanted to make sure I approached a person of color character sensitively and as knowledgeably as I could. I did a lot of reading, a lot of research, a lot of studying, trying to make her as solid a character as I could. In some ways, there's a little bit of me in her in that she's the older sibling of her family. I think her parents had big expectations for her. She was a very gifted child. I'm in no way a polyglot like she is. I gave her that gift thinking, gosh, that's something I wish I was good at. I wish I was good at acquiring language. I'm always so envious of people who can do that. But I did have sort of that upbringing of, oh, you're the gifted child. You're in these programs. We expect things from you. So she has sort of carried that in her family, whereas her brother was not put under the same amount of pressure, and I think it shows a little in their dynamic. But yeah, so I love seeing her kind of coming into her own more. She didn't get a lot of time in the first book, but coming in the second book, we're introduced to her mother and her brother, and see her in those interactions and start to see her expressing her opinions and wrestling with some of the things that she's learning with from Rachel that challenge her personal beliefs.
It sounds like there are lessons that a reader can take away, or you have goals for the reader in reading the book. Did you have a clear idea of what you wanted to accomplish in that respect before you started writing, or did these lessons or messages, did they reveal themselves to you after you'd written the book?
I think my goal in coming and starting to write the series was number one, to entertain, because that's what most of us who sit down to read book, particularly fantasy books, I think that's the number one thing we want, is to be entertained. And if the book's not doing that, then why pick it up? But the lessons, sometimes they kind of grow organically from the plot as I write it. Other times I have an inkling of it going in. I knew I wanted to when I was writing the Rachel Leda back and forth in the second book, I knew there was going to be a lesson that the two of them had to come to, that these are two very, very different women from very, very different backgrounds, but that they had a common experience in the first book, a bit of a trauma bond, but they then thrown together in the second book where they're having to learn from each other. And I knew that I had to show that this was a challenge for them, but that this was something they both had to come to, that they had to find a way to come together. So it was. I didn't want it to be a heavy-handed lesson of, get along, y'all, but it had to show a little bit of, there is common ground for people, and it may not always be obvious, but it's something that's worth looking for, and it's something that's worth finding.
I would think, in many respects, you have a lot more freedom to do whatever you want with the story and the characters if you have created the world versus having to have your characters and your plot lines fit nice and neatly into reality as we know it. But is there also sort of a responsibility to make sure that the world that you've created still feels real, that it's still something that we can relate to? So imagine it's freedom, but probably not complete freedom.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of truth in that. It's there's a great deal of freedom in fantasy to take something and run with it, maybe make something that hasn't been seen before, or look at it in a new way, to show it in a new light. And I think it's in sci-fi and fantasy that there's long been a tradition of, holding up a mirror to parts of society that maybe we to look at it in a new way. One of the things I always enjoy doing in world building, like I mentioned with Rachel's world stemming from a matriarchy, is to look at how different her upbringing was from, say, Lita's or any other woman of our world. Show that, that she's she's still Rachel is still human. These are still human beings, but raised in such a very different environment, a very different history, that I hope people can take a look at, what I'm showing of her culture and her background, and think about how she's then seeing our world, and how very different our world must look to her than it does to us. There's a moment in my first book where Bach comments to her about something, saying, I find that very weird. And she kind of goes off on him saying, let me tell you what's weird about your world. Because there are things in this world I find very weird. I don't understand why you have manicured lawns. That's bizarre. Why are you pumping chemicals into your dirt just so it looks good? And I hope that little moments like that are thought provoking to people. So I mean, there is a freedom in being able to write what I want, but if all I do is go off and write and write and write, and don't bring it back to something that the reader can recognize, something that the reader can point at, maybe look at and go, huh, yeah, maybe, then I don't, maybe I'm not using the freedom in the most responsible or interesting way. I don't feel that I'm doing my job as a writer if I'm not engaging the reader.
Well, what are your plans for this series? You've got two books out now, Gatekeeper and Blue Flame. You said you've got a draft of a third book complete. Do you have plans for even more in the series?
There will be at least one more. I made the decision to sort of, I had a much longer plan initially, and then when I took another look at it, I'm like, oh gosh, I think maybe I'm overdoing things. I'm going off on different tangents I don't need to. So I made a decision. I need to condense some things down, cut some things, and stick to the main plot as much as possible. So there'll be at least one more book, but I haven't sat down to map it all out yet. So 4, maybe 5 books. But yeah, the third one will definitely open the floodgates on this shadowy conspiracy happening that's bridging two worlds.
Have you always been a writer? You mentioned you had an idea for this book a while back, and you've
Mhm.
been working on, trying to get the first one written, and finally it is. But was writing something you have always wanted to do?
I first started writing in the sixth grade. Actually, I had a sixth grade English teacher. She had assigned a short story project, and she actually came up to me after class and praised me for how creative and interesting this short story was that I'd written. And I was kind of dumbfounded. I'd never been just so openly praised for something I'd written before. And I thought, well, I kind of enjoyed writing that. Maybe I can do some more, which is when I just started just in my own time instead of for class, writing things, world building, and just being on my merry little way. I found from doing it that it was a great sort of self-medication for my anxiety. I didn't understand at the time that I had anxiety. That was something I was diagnosed with much later. But I understood that I felt better after writing for a while. So once I started on that, I didn't really want to stop. It was good for me.
And do you have more goals for your writing journey? Do you have a wish list of books you want to write beyond the Daemon Collecting series?
I'm always thinking of new ideas. It's just a question of what I can get to work. I do, however, have a new trilogy that I'm starting. The first book is tentatively scheduled for November of next year. So still in the process of editing with the publishing company and going through things. Don't yet have a title because my working title was absolutely horrible and I had absolutely no ideas. I said, please suggest something. So waiting to hear on that, but that will be a completely different story. So I would love to fully intend to write the trilogy on that, finish up the Daemon Collecting series in 4 and 5 books. Beyond that, I don't know, maybe I'm waiting for inspiration to strike.
Have you received any advice along the way in this writing journey of yours that has really made a difference for you, either in your writing or how you go about the business of writing?
Always ask for help when you need it, even when you're not sure if you need it. It's been a huge help for me when I joined a local critique group, and that was many years ago when I first moved to North Carolina and found this critique group. And I was a nervous wreck going in there thinking, oh, they're going to hate everything I write. They're going to tear it to shreds. But they were so encouraging and just so lovely. And I'm still with the group today, and they're still helping me be a better writer. I have learned so much just from hearing their ideas, hearing their helpful criticisms. I've now developed this critic voice in my head because of them thinking, oh no, I can almost hear my one critique friend telling me no, that I shouldn't use these words so much, or that I shouldn't use that. So never be afraid to reach out to look for a fresh set of eyes when you're writing, or a fresh perspective. Because even if, like me, it absolutely terrifies you to put something of yours on the table to share with everybody, it can be the most rewarding experience.
It sounds like that part of this journey has been pretty great for you, but I'm curious. I usually ask what the best part of someone's writing journey is. Is it the community or are there others?
I don't know that there's been just one. The biggest part of my writing journey was realizing how instrumental it was to helping with my anxiety, that I could sit down and write for an hour or two and just feel so much better in myself, in my own skin, that it has been huge. And even if I never publish again, even if everything just completely falls apart and I can never publish another book, I will still write, because it's having that outlet has been rewarding in knowing I can create something, and also just in knowing that this is something that I need on some level to be the best me that I can be.
And that's nicely said, because I think a lot of authors feel that way, whether they recognize it as obviously as you do, but the act of writing does make us better.
Absolutely.
Well, if people want to learn more about you and your books, follow for new releases, that sort of thing, where can they go to find you?
I have a website, www.daemoncollecting.com. I'm also on Instagram at alevyauthor. On Twitter and Facebook, also alevyauthor. Not as active on those. So come see me on Instagram for best response, or come visit my website.
And if people are looking to purchase a copy of Gatekeeper or Blue Flame, where can they go to buy them?
There's a link on my website. They're also available on Amazon.
Wonderful. Well, Alison, I want to thank you very much for joining me today on the podcast. And I want to wish you luck with the Daemon Collecting series. We will look forward to book 3 and then hopefully maybe 4 and 5 to follow. And good luck with the new trilogy that you are working on. So congratulations on everything you've accomplished so far, and best of luck with the rest of your writing journey.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful to be here.
The Bookshop at the End of the Internet is a podcast dedicated to helping book lovers discover new authors. Like any good bookshop, this podcast features a wide variety of books by the equally varied and interesting authors who felt compelled to write them. This podcast gives you a chance to meet these wonderful writers and discover your next must-read book. Listen to the authors describe their books and tell you their stories in their own words. My interviews feature books from all genres and authors from all walks of life, including those who are indie published, as well as those published by small presses and large publishing houses. Looking for unique, not so easy to find books for yourself, a friend, or a book club? Tune into this podcast and find your newest favorite author, or maybe a soon-to-be bestseller. This podcast, like all the best bookshops, is filled with all kinds of books and all kinds of authors. Tune in, browse around, find a new author, and discover a new favorite book. You never know what treasures you might find in the Bookshop at the End of the Internet.